In this video, we're going to finish converting our user routes to use authentication. Down below, there are a couple of important routes that aren't using authentication, such as the ability to update a user profile or delete a given user. We want to make sure we're using authentication for these as well. Now, it might not seem like it, but we're actually nearing the end of the section. In this video, we're going to take care of all of the user routes, and then in the next couple, we'll focus on the task-related routes and setting up that association where each task is owned by a specific user. For now, though, we're going to focus on the last three routes in this file: deleting a user by ID, updating a user by ID, and then getting a user by ID. Now, this first one is actually not something we need anymore. We should not be able to get a user by ID unless it's our own user ID, in which case we already have a route that gets that done up above. This is how we can fetch our own user profile. I shouldn't be able to fetch the user profile of other users for the application. So we have three routes that need fixing, and we're going to take the easy way out with the first one and end up removing it altogether. Now, the other two are things we still want to be able to do. Users should be able to update their profile, and they should be able to remove their profile altogether. So with these, we'll do a bit of refactoring, integrating authentication, and then wiring it up to work correctly. We'll start with delete together, then we'll focus on update afterwards, and right here, the first thing we're gonna do is add the auth middleware into the mix. So I'll be passing in auth as the second argument, moving our callback function to the third argument position, meaning that this is only going to run if the user is authenticated. From here, we want to adjust the path. This is taking in the ID of the user to remove, and even if you're authenticated, we don't want you to be able to provide the ID of the user to remove. Instead, we're going to remove you. You should not be able to provide the ID of another user to delete them, either accidentally or maliciously. So right here, the path will change to /users/me as a way to remove your own user profile. Now this means we will have to make a small change to the code down below. We have request.params.id, which no longer exists. The ID we're going to use instead is request.user._id. Remember, we attached the user onto the request object, and we do have access to it since we are using the authentication middleware. If we weren't using this middleware, then we wouldn't have request.user, but we are, so we do. And there we go. This is all we need to do to allow a logged in user to delete their own profile. Now we could change things up even further. In this case, there's no need to check if there was a user with that ID, since we literally just fetched them from the database when authenticating. So let's go ahead and refactor out these lines right here. I'm going to go ahead and comment them out using command / or control / depending on your operating system. And we're going to replace all of that with a single statement down below. Right here, we're going to be using the remove method on the Mongoose document. So we have save for saving the data that we've changed, and we've used that plenty of times before. But we also have on user the following remove. Now this is indeed asynchronous, so I'll use await with it. So all we're doing here is removing the user who's authenticated. It achieves the exact same result as what we had above, but in my opinion, it's a nicer setup. Down below, the last thing we have to change is what exactly we're sending back. We no longer have a standalone user variable. Instead, we have request.user, and there we go. Now we have the final version of this endpoint, and we can test it out from Postman. So I'm going to head over to Postman and go to my delete user request near the bottom. Now this still has the old URL structure, so the first thing I'm going to do is remove the ID and replace it with me. So /users/me. I'll go ahead and save that request to make sure that we use the same URL structure in the future. And there's no need to worry about authentication since it's inheriting that from the parent. Now we can actually fire this off and see what we get. Down below, I get a 200, meaning that things went well, and right here I can see the profile of the user that was deleted. If I send this off again, I would expect things to fail since I've completely trashed that user account and they're no longer in the database. Now, because we've set up Postman automation, we can get back up and running with a single request. I create a new user using the create user request. I'm now logged in as them and I can continue experimenting with my other routes, such as reading a profile. So being able to work with Postman and easily switch between requests is going to be really important in the long run. With deleting user out of the way, let's go ahead and focus on the other route we need to take care of, the ability to update the user profile. So we'll end up making a similar set of changes, restricting it to the user who's authenticated, as opposed to allowing you to update any user if you know their ID. That's not what we want for our application. You should only be able to update your own user profile when you're authenticated correctly. Right here, this is going to be your challenge for the video. You'll be refactoring the update profile route shown below. So first up, we want to change the URL structure. We no longer want to accept an ID as part of that. Next up, we want to add the authentication middleware into the mix. You should only be able to update a user profile if you are authenticated. From there, you're going to use the existing user document instead of fetching a new one by the parameter provided. We're no longer going to have that parameter, and there's no longer a need to fetch the user since we already have access to them on request. So you'll use that instead throughout the entire function. Anytime we use user, you'll have to use request.user instead. Next up, you want to test your work in Postman. So try to update a user profile and make sure it works as expected. Take as much time as you need to knock this out. Test your work. When you're done, come back and click play. How'd you do? Let's go ahead and kick things off with step number 1. We need to update that URL. No longer are we going to accept an ID. Instead, it'll be /users/me for updating your own profile. Next up, we have to add authentication into the mix to know which user we're actually going to update since we're no longer accepting their ID as a URL parameter. Right here, to get that done, we just pass in the auth middleware as the second argument, moving our callback to the third argument position. Next up, we have to make changes to the callback function code, and we want to use the existing user document on request.user instead of fetching a new one down below. Now, I can highlight user by just clicking anywhere inside of it to see all of the times we've used it. Right here, there are a few different use cases of it, so we have to make sure we address all of those in order to complete step 3 successfully. Everything up above can stay exactly as it is. That's perfectly fine. We're going to start by removing this line right here. We no longer need to fetch the user by that parameter. Instead, we're just going to access request.user, which already exists. So right here, we are setting properties on user. That doesn't exist anymore. Instead, it is request.user. Down below, we try to save the user. It needs to be request.user.save. From here, we run a little code to figure out if the user actually existed. We know they existed, so this can be removed completely. And we know they existed because they just logged in about 10 milliseconds ago. So from here, we can now continue on down the list. The last thing we do is we send that user back. Request.user is what we're going to send back. And now that we have this in place, our patch route is actually all done. We can move on to the final step, which is to test our work over inside of Postman. Right here, I'll be removing the challenge comments, which I have in place, and we'll move over to Postman and try to update a user profile. So right here, if I read the user profile, I can see the current information. Let's go ahead and actually change that using update user down below. Now, once again, I do have to remove the ID from the URL and swap that out with /users/me instead. And now I can use the body to determine what exactly I'd like to change. Let's go ahead and provide some changes we'd like to apply. I'll start by changing the age. I'll go ahead and set that equal to 27. I think it's 0 right now. Let me double check. Yes, it is. And I'll also change the name. So right here, I can go back to update user. I'll update that name to the following. Let's go ahead and use something like Mike. And finally, I'll also update the password. I'll change the password over to something new. Let's go ahead and use computer 098. Perfect. Now that we have this in place, I'm going to fire the request off to test that things worked as expected. Down below, I do see the name of Mike and the age of 27. The only thing I'm not sure about is if the password got changed correctly. So let's go ahead and try to log in once again. I'm going to take the password and copy it to the clipboard, though you could just memorize it. We're going to head over to the login user request, and this should now fail since I've updated the password. Right here, it is indeed failing, which is excellent. Now I'm going to take the old password, remove it, and put the new password in. I'm going to send that off, and once again, it works. So down below, I can see I was able to log in with the new password and without the old one, letting us know that the update worked as expected. So down below, for that update user request, I am going to go ahead and save it so we can use these settings going forward. Now, I just changed the password for logging in. In order to make sure things work consistently, I'll also change the password for creating the user, though I could have just reverted the login request to using the same password I had used before. As long as those two are consistent, it'll be easy to switch back and forth. Now that we have this in place, all of the routes in the user file are using authentication, and they're locked down in a way where a user can only manipulate their own profile. They can't go off and mess with other users that are using the Task Manager application. Now, with the user routes out of the way, it's time to focus on something we haven't touched on so far this section, our task-related routes. We're going to start that process in the next lesson, so let's go ahead and jump right in.